This conference will now be recorded.
And we're now being recorded. Thank you for doing that. And I wanted to start things out by just asking if there's any announcements that people have, anything they want to share with the network today. Anyone want to jump in?
Hi, this is Tamara.
Hey, Tamara.
Hi. I just noticed that the AGU's session proposals it's open now. People can start submitting proposals for sessions for AGU. So we usually do have a set of climate literacy sessions. So I'd encourage people to think about submitting a session. I think the deadline's not till April, so we still have some time. But I think it's just been open.
Yeah, it was just open. This is Katie Boyd. I think you're right. Mid-April was the deadline. So yeah, I think, and Patrick just mentioned that we may try to schedule one of our calls in the next few weeks. I think March 19th should be open. So we may keep that open for discussing session proposals for you. So
right. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Awesome.
And I just wanted to add to this, Anna goals. We've been, the last few years, we've over-proposed, and anyone who's been a facilitator knows how it's kind of challenging to merge sessions later on. So we were thinking that we might try to limit the number of sessions we are proposing this time, so that we can, that we don't have to do these painful mergers.
Cool.
So yeah, if you want to submit a session with clean or climate literacy, then plan to join us on March 19th, and we'll have a discussion about that.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any announcements? Well, I'll jump in. I haven't been on the call for a while. Apologies. I miss you guys. Been busy, but we have a couple of things I'd love folks to know about coming up, and I'll put links to them in the chat box. First of all, we are just kind of for fun and also just for educational purposes, we're doing a zero waste challenge starting in a week that we're asking as a staff here, and we're asking people to join us, and we're kicking it off with a webinar next Monday just about what does that mean to do zero waste, and why is it a climate change issue, and how can you do your own zero waste challenge. And so that's coming up. I'll put information about that in the chat box. Our Talk Climate Institute is coming up in March, and it's open for registration, and it's an institute that is focused on anyone that wants to think more about how we can have better conversations about climate change and develop our own climate stories that we can use to talk to policymakers, to communicate to audiences. And so I'll put info about that. And our Summer Institute for Climate Change Education is also open for registration, and that is going to be in August in Washington, D.C. And the focus is on the humanities and how we can be better at bringing climate change into the social studies and geography and ELA classrooms. And so that is also exciting. So I'll put info up about all those if you're interested. Would love for you all to share that with your networks. Does anyone else have an announcement? All right.
Actually,
yeah, go ahead.
This is Katie Boyd. I forgot that I mentioned this the last week or two also, but the clean webinars for just learning about clean and how to use the collection and using NGSS and all of that, we're starting our series up again. It's starting on Thursday. Let me grab the link and I'll put it in the chat. And we'll have one per week for the next 5 weeks. We have a new one that focuses on the human aspect, our Climate Literacy Principle 6 and human impacts of climate change. So anyways, this is not necessarily for all of you, but if you have teacher networks, I'm going to be sending out an email later today to remind people about this webinar series to the Clean Network. So please take that and share it with your networks if you would. I'd really appreciate that. And let me find the webinar page here, and I can put it in the chat box also. So that'll take you to where you can register for these webinars.
Thanks, Katie. All right. Well, I am going to go ahead and introduce our great presenter today. Alexis is coming to us to speak to us today on creative partnerships for communications. She's the co-director of Helicon Collaborative. And Helicon is a strategy and research consultancy focused on understanding and activating culture as a force for social and environmental change. Helicon's work at the intersection of art and environment is based on the idea that environmental problems are cultural in their root. In other words, the problem isn't really the environment out there, it is in here, in our sense of identity, where we find meaningful, how we imagine our future, our social norms, and dominant values. Our society wouldn't be able to make more decisive progress on environmental issues, regardless of our technical know-how, until we understand and shift the underlying cultural narratives and ideas that guide our individual and collective behavior. Helicon's work at this intersection has been focused on understanding and articulating what works, how artists and cultural strategies contribute to environmental progress, and what approaches are most effective and why. We think it is essential to direct the outpouring of creative energy towards the activities that will have the greatest environmental impact. So Alexis will be offering us insights from her research on how arts and culture can help us adapt to climate change and take action. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Alexis. I'm excited for your presentation. And Jen has a great reminder. If you are not presenting, could you please mute yourself? And that includes me. I'm going on mute. And there is
thank you.
There's actually a number of people that are not muted right now, and I'm hearing typing. So please mute yourself.
Okay. I think you can see my screen, I'm hoping. Let me know if you can't. Oh, whoops. Okay, hold on. All right. So yeah, thank you for that introduction, and it's good to see some familiar folks on the call. I'm looking forward to actually having a conversation about this because my thinking about this is evolving quite rapidly. So even if you heard me speak about this at AGU a few months ago, I think conditions are changing so quickly that, and our understanding of sort of where people are with climate change is changing. And so my thinking about what's needed and the role that culture can play is also changing. So you'll forgive me, I hope, if some of these ideas are even a little bit unformed, but I think that a lot of the research that we've been doing is only proving that arts and culture are more relevant than perhaps we even thought before. I'll start just by saying a little bit about how I come at this topic. I've worked in the arts and cultural space for a really long time, about 20 years, but as an anthropologist by training. So I'm really interested in the cultural dimensions of how we live our lives and construct society, how we understand who we are and our relationship to ourselves and to the world, to each other. And culture is just the technology of how we do that, how we kind of make sense of things. And so when I started thinking about climate change, I was coming from that space and was thinking, what is it that I can do from where I sit? I'm not going to become a scientist. I'm not going to, run for office, but I do feel like there's something that I need to be doing about this. And started really thinking about and exploring the space of arts and culture in terms of the relationship that it had to the environment. And the questions that I've been interested in and Helicon has been interested in our work are twofold. Both what are the dimensions of climate change that are cultural in nature? So in the intro, you heard a little bit about how we think about that, but really exploring what it means that, you know, we have this existential crisis that we seem to be unable to address. What is it that's making it so challenging for us to address that, especially if we know many of the solutions that we need to implement and we're not doing it? So that was where, you know, we started to realize, aha, this is actually something that's really deeply embedded in how we see ourselves in the world, and what we think is right and normal, and the kind of constraints that we're placing on our own selves. And then the second piece of it is how can art and artists contribute to creating a more just and sustainable future, which is really what we think that we're all working for. So I'll share a little bit about what we found about how arts and culture, quote unquote, works, and also share some ideas, these evolving ideas about how we as people who are in this space of education and communication might approach working on and through culture to address this issue. And when I use the word culture, just as a caveat, I mean everything from pop culture, movies, TV, to plays, nonprofit culture, to stories that we tell each other and ourselves, to the visual imagery that we use in rituals, fashion, food, you know, cultural traditions. So it's just everything that's the way that we create and share meaning, beliefs, identities, shape our worldviews. And it's both what we create, what you so-called professional artists might create for public consumption, as well as the informal and personal practices that inform our everyday lives. So just as a definitional point. So when I started doing work in this space, in just researching, you know, what's happening in this intersectional space, what I found is that there was really a growing awareness among people in the environmental sector that art and artists could help them communicate more effectively with the public about climate change. The predominant issue at the time, and this was only a few years ago, was defined as the fact that climate change was not urgent, it was not personal or salient for people, and this lack of public interest was assumed to be the primary barrier preventing politicians and businesses from taking more pro-climate actions. And many of you, I think, know Tony Leiserowitz at Yale and others, Marta, others have talked about how important it is for the environmental sector to get away from using really abstract language of data and policy, which alienates people from an issue that already seems really far away in time and space. And instead, people are saying, you know, we need to connect with people on emotional and personal levels, where social science tells us that our values and beliefs and opinions are formed and changed. And I actually spoke with Tony in 2016, who told me that, you know, this is a link to an article and interview that I did with him, but, you know, who told me that art is really this powerful mechanism, because it is the storytelling and imagery are the way that we actually kind of interpret our reality, and it connects with this emotional side of our brains. So I want to start just because I think most of us on this call already have kind of gone through this space many times, just by acknowledging that we know that art works in this way. And this is, so that's kind of the baseline knowledge now. And I saw this at AGU. It was really heartening to see that there's really a lot of energy in the environmental sector around this idea in the science sector. And there's really been a proliferation of interest in the last few years in working with artists and storytellers to find more effective ways to communicate about climate change. And I've even been working with some people in the utility sector and water utilities who, you know, are not known for being the most adventurous group, who are really eager to integrate art into their communication strategies. You know, so I think that the idea that there's a better way to communicate about science and policy is becoming much more common, which is great. You know, artists now we see communicate sorry, every time I click my screen. Okay, so artists are at climate marches, they're at international climate meetings. You know, we're seeing that mainstream media are using really powerful imagery and language to talk about and tell stories about climate change. And, you know, I think this is becoming easier because the effects are becoming a lot more visible and obvious, and they're happening closer to home. And we're also seeing that artists independently are becoming activated around climate as an issue and making art intended to raise awareness. Just last year, there was a convening of theater artists to talk about, you know, how do we make theater in an age of climate change, and what does that look like? So I think there's really a lot of energy around this, which should be great, right? So activity means progress, because we know art creates change. And it turns out that yes and no. So we are making progress in the sense that more people believe in and are worried about climate change than ever. But at the same time, there's a decline in hope that we can do anything about it. And so there's this widening gap between worry and hope. And so I think this is really where we need to focus, and I want to really spend some time on this, because despite the fact that there's an increasing amount of worry and belief, actually, that, you know, this is a big issue, that we need to take action on it, there's a lack of pro-environmental action on both individual and societal levels. So it turns out, unfortunately for me as a warrior, that belief and worry don't necessarily lead to change, to pro-environmental action. And on a societal level, this means that our emissions are rising. We're, as you all know, we're way off track for meeting our Paris goals. And on an individual level, it's almost even more confusing. A 2018 study found that climate change skeptics were actually more likely than believers to engage in pro-environmental behaviors. And there's a group called the Environmental Voter Project, which has found that 10 to 15 million super environmentalists, which means that the environment is their #1 issue, routinely don't vote. So their work is trying to figure out how to make these folks take the biggest, most important action that can make change. So there's a few things going on here, and I won't go into them all because I'm not a psychologist, but just the point I want to make is that worrying doesn't create the change that we need, and it can actually have the opposite effect, right? That it can trigger fear and avoidance, especially when people don't feel like there's anything they can do, or when the actions that they're encouraged to take aren't aligned with the scale of the problem, right? So there's the famous Al Gore, change your light bulbs moment, where, you know, an Inconvenient Truth proposed that as the action to take. And I think that as an environmental sector, we've continued to make those sorts of suggestions that individual behavior changes are the key, right? Or when the things that we know we need to do, we feel like we can't do and still maintain a semblance of a normal life, right? Like, I have intense guilt around flying, and often choose not to do it, and yet, you know, that means I can't see my family and my friends. So we're giving people a false choice. So I think that right now, the moment that we're in is different from where we were even a few years ago, where, and I know this might be a controversial proposal, but I think we need to pivot from talking about the problem and thinking about helping people become aware that climate change is a problem, to helping people actually grapple with and meet the moment that we're in. And so I think that when we think about literacy, I'm just thinking about what would it take to be truly literate about climate in this moment. What we need to do is actually think about what are the kinds of literacies we need now. So I'm suggesting a few things. One, I think we need to stop just focusing on convincing believers, or even primarily, because we know that that's not the major barrier to change. The truth is, even if 100% of people believed that it was the issue, it wouldn't necessarily manifest in the changes that we need. So telling people about how bad it is without helping people find a viable path forward actually increases fear and denial and hopelessness and all these things. So it doesn't mean we don't need to be honest about what's happening. In fact, I think we need to be more honest about the scope of what's happening, but we can't stop there. So we need to be honest about the root causes of what the problem really is, that the causes stem from our worldview and our way of life. And I want to show this slide, which is a quote from Ursula Le Guin. But when we think about what are the kind of root causes of climate, I think many people now and still a small number proportionally, but a number of people are talking about how we need to actually confront some of the deepest worldviews, like, for example, capitalism, which Ursula Le Guin points out is so ubiquitous and so kind of deeply embedded in our mindset that we see it as something inevitable. And even though now we're hearing from economists that we can't actually address the climate challenge unless we start to address our economy. So starting to really be honest about how deeply the causes are rooted and how much we need to change is really important, because that's a way of people seeing that this is an authentic challenge, people including ourselves. And I think until recently, most environmentalists didn't really want to go at this or know how to go at this, challenging these large scale systems. And so we've advocated for technological solutions that maintain the status quo, or we argue for modest individual changes that really don't come close to addressing the problems. And then this is where I think that art and culture really has a key role to play, which is that I think we need to support a process of transformation. Because I think as we increasingly wake up to the reality and the magnitude of what we're facing, whether it's because we experience the destructive effects on our own lives or we just have an awakening, we are going to need to learn how to adapt and respond in resilient and creative ways. And we can already see this happening in some of what I'll talk about in the examples of where this has happened in frontline communities, which requires an individual process of grappling with things like grief and fear and despair and loss, but also with learning how to imagine something different. And so I think as individuals and as a society, we're going to need to question how we have lived, and also be able to imagine something beyond what we know. And I think that in both those cases, those are areas where artists excel, right? I mean, culture has always worked on the level of meaning and narrative. It's been the way human beings throughout time have grappled with questions like, existential questions like, who do we think we are? How should we relate to each other and the world? How can I make meaning out of this difficult experience I'm having? What could be different than it currently is? So it's a tool for processing imagination. That's how our myths have always worked, but it's also a tool for creativity and for thinking about what could be. And so I think that in this moment, what we really need is not a population of people aware of a problem but swimming in despair because they don't know what to do about it, and so watching Netflix. But we need to actually have a population that feels capable of responding with the appropriate amount of radical hope, imagination, and a sense of creative agency. And in order to get there, we may need to allow people and help guide people, including ourselves, through a process of grieving in order to get to that next phase. So, and as I said, I want to share a couple of examples of how this has worked, because I think that especially with regard to frontline communities that have experienced great loss, what we've seen is that arts and culture can actually help people, get to the place where they're able to see something different than what they currently have, but they actually do have to go through that period of grieving. So this is just very basic, two ways that culture can work, healing and imagination. And there's many other ways that culture works in different, in a lot of our research, we've framed it in many different ways. But as I said, my thinking about this is evolving quite a bit, and it's starting to become much more boiled down for me that these are not the only ways culture can work, but the ways that culture works that other things don't work. And so it's sort of the unique value proposition of working with artists and working through culture around the climate crisis. So I want to share a couple of examples. There's an organization called Clear Creek Creative, which is an artist collective that's based in Kentucky in coal country, which is a community that's really suffered a lot from both the production of coal and its decline. And this is mountaintop removal. So, coal destroyed both people's health and the environment, but it was also the main economic driver for the region. So in 2011, when this group started working there, which they're from there, but they really started working in earnest in the community, the prevailing conversation in the community was, let's bring back coal, right? People could not imagine anything else for themselves, even though the coal industry had really devastated them. It was part of their identity. It was how people knew their place, right? And so the artists began inviting the community together to share meals with food, homegrown food, and to play music and tell stories. And those are really, those aren't just random cultural practices. Those are really ways that this particular community in Appalachia knows itself, right? Like music, Appalachian music, storytelling, those are cultural practices of this region. So those were used as a way to help people reconnect to the land, to their culture, and to each other. And over the course of about 3 years, the community, which was farmers and former mine workers and other kinds of residents, shared stories about their experience with coal and also what the place meant to them and what they wanted for their future. So they started from really a place of, what they didn't have, but they also started from what they did have. And so talked about their assets and talked about what they had there, the land, their foodways, their storytelling. And out of this, the artists worked with them to create a participatory theater piece that told the story, kind of an imaginative story, and a kind of a reminiscent story of their past and their future. And the community then performed that for each other. So this might seem like kind of a soft and nice way of engaging people, and isn't that nice? But I want to make the point that this kind of cultural work actually has real environmental implications. So in a few years later, in 2014, the natural gas industry began coming to the region looking to buy land. And it's a really common strategy in places that are poor and disinvested. They become, they cycle through many generations of extractive industries. And because the community, in part, because the community had just spent 3 years talking about how much they love the land, celebrating their land-based culture, envisioning a better future, and it didn't involve fracking. They had a sense of community pride and a sense of possibility of a different kind of future. And they had also built trust and social networks that now allowed information about what was going on to spread really quickly. So they created a plan and they created a network to stay informed and organized, and they decided that they weren't going to sell their land collectively. So this is just more pictures of the process there. So this is a quote from one of the artists who is talking about how providing access to the tools of really reframing the narrative and healing through stories is a creative and collaborative way to radically manifest the future we want, which involved, importantly, coming to terms with the despair of what wouldn't be. So coal isn't going to come back. They came to terms with that, and in doing so, they were able to imagine something different. And I think that's really, really important. So I think in terms of frontline communities which are experiencing things that we will all experience in one way or another soon, in terms of feeling loss, feeling fear and grief as we're grappling with what's going to change, which we know to be true because that scientists are telling us we will have significant changes regardless of what we do now. That there is a process of catharsis, which is making sense of that, and in order to be able to move forward. So art, as I said, has always been a way people have done this through time, and we're seeing that this is happening in many, many places around the country, and I'm assuming around the world, as artists are working in communities in this way. So the other piece of it is imagination. And, in part of our research, we talked to a lot of people in the environmental sector. And one of the things that we've consistently heard is that one of the biggest barriers, there's a woman named Jody Van Horn who works with Sierra Club's Ready for 100 campaign, which is trying to get the country to be 100% renewable. And she says the biggest challenge in building support for renewable energy is that people don't know what that would look like. She said we need to create a cultural conversation around clean energy, not just a scientific one. We know that sweeping policy change will only follow an on-the-ground shift in public expectations, but we can't just tell people that wind and solar are better and do economic impact studies about how they create jobs. People can't imagine it unless it is made visible. People need to see and feel it. How does my daily life change? How does my street feel different without cars, and so on? And so the point here is that, we're trying to create something that we've never had. And so in order to do that, we need to stimulate a kind of radical imagination. And so many people in the environmental sector that I've spoken with have said, what we need from the arts is actually to help people imagine what that could look like and feel like in a very visceral way so that people want to go there. And this is I think artists in the best sense, they build worlds, both imaginatively and literally, that can help people feel and experience and imagine things beyond what it currently exists. And the other thing we've seen, and there's a lot of data to support this, that creative practice, actually doing things, activates people's sense of agency in other domains of their lives. So once people do something, it could be as simple as creating a little diorama of a future home that they want, whatever it is. They start to see that they are makers. And so they become makers and doers in other areas of their lives as well. So this is an organization. It's actually a couple of an artist and an architect. And they have started doing these speculative competitions around the world. They did one in Santa Monica in 2016, where they basically, their proposal is renewable energy should be in urban areas, not just wind farms in the middle of the desert. And it should be something that's beautiful. It should be our new form of civic art. And if we can get people excited about what that can be, we'll have people will stop resisting these as visual pollution, which often happens. So they, look really ugly. Let me see if I have a picture. Yeah. So, things that people do not want. And so there's a lot of protest around these kinds of things. So they're wanting to create excitement about how this could actually be something that we really want to see. And this is, our world could look even better, not just because it's more efficient and it does all these things that we know we have to do, but it's something that creates spaces that we actually want to be in. So they run these competitions around the world for site-specific public artwork that also generates energy. And they have multidisciplinary teams that include artists and engineers, local middle schoolers form teams, and everyone comes up with designs that are then judged by the community members, which sparks a really public conversation around not only aesthetics and energy efficiency, but also values and community identity. Like, what do we want our community to say about itself through this public art? So something that's really important to mention is that these projects aren't actually built yet. So most of them don't get built as is, but the competitions prompt the community to start to imagine and visualize what a future could look like that would be radically different from what it looks like now. And those conversations then create a pathway for more transformative change, which has resulted in local adaptation plans becoming much more ambitious than they otherwise would be. And some of the elements of these things get incorporated. So it expands the landscape of imagination. And several of the teams actually in this 2018 competition actually took it a step further, and they used virtual reality to help people engage with the design in an even more visceral way. And this is a quote from one of the artists who talks about it as cultural time travel, which can create a sense of longing for the future. And, I think about where we are right now in our political climate and, the kind of stimulation by Trump of the longing for the past, this, desire to go back to a time when it was great. And I think we all know that that's not going to happen. And I don't want to, I don't think that's just a far right sentiment. I think a lot of us in this moment when things are really tough are often longing for a past that we'd love to crawl back under the covers and find something that, I know I would often. I wish my future was, looked better than I think it probably will look. But how can we actually not provoke an alternative, which is a desire to really move into this moment in a proactive and an imaginative and exciting way. So I think there's a lot of potential for this kind of immersive artwork and really helping us to experience a future that we want to move towards. So, so I just put our links to our papers here, which are, as I said, framed a little bit differently, and there's a lot more examples in them. But I just want to say that I think, I'm coming to this place where I think one of our biggest challenges in getting to the future that we want is overcoming, is actually going through the transformative process. It's not recognizing, it's not having a moment of insight that we're facing a crisis. It's actually going through the process of change. And because arts and culture can help us connect to our deepest levels, our values, and actually operate on them and change them, but also help us connect to ourselves and our identity. And it can also help us imagine. I think it's sort of a technology that can allow us to move forward in this moment in time. So I think that's both a resilient mindset and also a visionary mindset where we can be co-creators with the moment in time. So I think as I'm starting to try to see my role as working in the space, not as a kind of an alarm bell, but actually as more of a midwife or something. And I think that there might be a moment for us as educators and kind of messengers to operate more in that frame of mind. So I just want to offer that and see. I'd be really curious to see what people think and hear if people have other ideas, and because I know you're all working in this space in a variety of ways. So I'll end there for now.
Great. Thanks, Alexis. Wow, that was really great. Does anyone have any questions that have bubbled up?
I see that Bonnie had a question in the chat there, just on that picture of the solar panels you had, Alexis. Where was that placed?
The picture, this one? Oh.
The next one.
The next one. This one. This one's in Melbourne, in Australia.
Oh, okay, great.
I'm curious. So as I mentioned to you earlier, we did a big event that basically brought these ideas sort of to life last weekend. And I would say I love these examples you shared because they are very positive. Kind of solutions forward. A lot of, I think what we have been working with and thinking about also were like examples where the arts and culture move us through sort of the grieving process too. I don't know if you caught Kate Marvel's Slaying the Climate Dragon. She was a NASA scientist that wrote this like story tale, and it's very, very sad, but it makes you feel. And I think we have the real belief that you need to be feeling before you can really like engage with this. What have you, so when presenting this, like you talked about giving people agency by once they do one thing, then they feel the agency to be able to do something again. What are some examples of like tangible actions that you've done that like have moved people from learning and thinking about how arts can engage us in this issue to like actually tangibly, doing something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are a lot of examples on pretty local scales. I'm thinking, well, first of all, I want to speak to your other question or your point you're making about the need to feel. which I think is really, really important. And I actually adjusted this presentation a lot after AGU, because in that presentation, I was talking a lot about the kind of the need to focus on solutions, which I think is really important, actually. But I also am conscious of the need to not kind of like gloss over the grief that people are feeling and the very legitimate experiences. And so I think it's a both and around that. Like, we need to both help people come to take the full measure of the problems that we're facing and the loss that's incurring, and then also kind of pull up our bootstraps, and just say, okay, well, what, in light of that, what do we do now? And
Right.
so that's the point I want to just hammer home. But yeah, the action thing. So, I think the examples I know best are local, and that's probably just because I study that more community-based stuff. But there's an artist, and this isn't specific to climate, but it's environmental. There's an artist named Dan Borelli who works in he's actually at Harvard, but he's from Ashland, Massachusetts, which is the site of a massive Superfund site because of a chemical dye factory, and it's been there for 30 years capped. And the community over this time has had extremely rare cancers and things like that, and they fought it in the beginning 30 years ago, but then they just lost hope. They really just decided that they were going to live with it, and because they didn't get any real response. The response they got was, well, we can't prove it, and so people kind of backed off and just took it as their lot. And he came up with this plan to use colored streetlights, and he used EPA data and used colored streetlights to illuminate the streetlights in the town with the color of the dye, and the brightness of the light reflected the quantity of the dye that was still present underground, which was in the water, leaking into the water supply. And then he led walks of the community through the town, and there were all sorts of other, artistic and creative things that they did. But what happened as a result of that is that a new generation of people in the town, a younger, his generation in their 40s, became reactivated, and they have started a community oversight group that is making sure that the town council is not authorizing new buildings over sites that have concentrations of this dye. They're, following up on health studies to prove and get people funding for health issues that they're having as a result of the contamination. So they basically reignited a sense of activism in the town, which was really kind of paralyzed by despair and a sense of resignation throughout most of his childhood, because it was just seen as well, this is just what we have to deal with. It is the way it is. So that's just one very tangible example, but there are a lot of examples of kind of the way that people via participating in, there's a lot of environmental justice groups that I've talked to actually that use art, not even related to they'll have people paint an unrelated mural that has nothing to do with the environment, but just because engaging in creative practice will actually bring people together, it'll get people excited about making things, and it'll kind of spark people's sense that they can do something to change the world that they live in, which then translates to other kinds of behaviors.
Cool. Thank you. It looks like Marta had a question. She said, can you talk about the transdisciplinary work that happened with artists and others with the U.S. Water Alliance? How that work was brought together? What were the results? How many entities are included? Do you know what Marta's talking about?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, although Marta, I may need you to clarify the question. I mean, just for everybody's awareness, the U.S. Water Alliance project, we invited them to a working group that we did with Art Place America, which is a funder group that supports art that is targeted towards different kinds of community goals. And we worked with them specifically around environmental issues. And the U.S. Water Alliance participated as an advisor in that work. And then we followed up with another research project with the U.S. Water Alliance, looking specifically at how art and artists were working to help make change in the water space. So whether it's around helping people, like helping reduce public resistance to new water treatment plants, or all sorts of things. And so we created a report with them about that. And then the most interesting thing that happened was they invited a pretty big, I would say, like maybe 50 artists to come to their yearly summit, which is mostly water utilities and water reliant businesses. So there's a critical mass of artists that came and participated in the whole summit, and was really integrated into conversations, like in working groups, but also were on the stage. And so it was quite powerful, and there was a lot of interest among the utilities and among the businesses in collaborating with artists. But Marta, what exactly is your question, just so I make sure I answer it?
I was just wanting you to talk a little bit more about it, just because folks won't know about it so much, and on this call, particularly because there are people really interested and active in climate change from various disciplines, and just the idea, or the possibility of banding together with unlike or previously unimagined entities to come together, to create kind of a collective impact that otherwise can't or hasn't previously worked with organizations working separately or alone.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to like how do you actually, or how does one actually reach out, and how, what are the possibilities then? I keep thinking about, I don't know why, maybe it's I'm in the mountains, and so we have, there's rain and snow, and then that goes down into little rivulets, and then that goes into brooks and or streams, and then that goes into rivers, and then it's the Mississippi, and then it's the ocean, and I just keep thinking about everybody working together across disciplines, and what can that do? Because you've done so much of that, or been privy to so much of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that's, a lot of the work that we profiled for the U.S. Water Alliance was specifically around artists working with utilities, or artists working with community organizations, that environmental organizations around river cleanup and things like that. So really water specific. But yeah, I mean, I think that the big opportunity is really to recognize. I think that the kind of nuance I'm realizing now and wanting to make is that I think that when we recognize that the thing that needs to change is human beings, and it needs to be a process of kind of awakening and transformation, then there's an opportunity for artists to not just be brought in to communicate about an issue, or present data in a more flashy and compelling way, that there's actually, and many of the artists that we spoke to talked about this, that there's actually a way for artists to come in and do things that need to be done in order for us to move forward. So I'm thinking of an artist in Minneapolis named Shania Madison, and she and her partner have an entity called Water Bar, and they basically invite people to. It's actually a bar. I mean, it's a physical space on a street, and people can come in, and they have a bar set up, and you can come in and you can taste water from different places, and they have water tenders tending bar, and they can be everybody from your local water utility person to an engineer to an activist, whatever, farmer, and they just have conversations about water. And they don't have an activist agenda. I mean, of course they're pro environment, but they're not trying to push a certain perspective. And what they found is that they build the relationships that get built there, and the conversations that happen there are completely transformative, and people do change their minds, and they are moved to action. And they've been asked by the governor and by many water agencies to actually come in and help facilitate processes where the traditional way that governments and agencies have done that have been so technocratic. They've been expert driven, and they really hinder, people harden into their political positions or their points of view, and they don't, it's very hard to come to common ground. And what they've realized is to get to change around water, the water issues that need to be negotiated, whether it's, how much water goes to farms or whether farms are polluting urban water sources or vice versa. There needs to be this kind of deep relationship building on a human level. And the artist method is particularly good at that. And so it's kind of bringing artists in where their skills are most valuable, not asking them to do something that they're not well suited to do. So I think that speaks to your point, Warda, that there's really a lot of room for kind of everybody to come in with their own expertise and be part of this moment that we have now.
That's so cool that you mentioned them. They were part of our event last weekend. They were one of our workshops, the Water Bar.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we partnered up with them. We're based in Minneapolis.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, they are amazing folks. And they have really centered equity in their work as well. They're bringing in very diverse audiences, which is extremely impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
This is Karen. I'm really, thank you for your presentation today. I'm really excited about your bringing together the social community building elements and the creativity to really spark imagination and moving towards a new vision for a future that's more in keeping with where we're all aiming. And you said that this is really tends to be local work, and I can understand why. And our big challenge for all of us is how we move from local to scale. And recently, I've been really impressed with the way the Drawdown Challenge has been working at moving from local to scale. I don't know if everybody on the call is familiar with the Drawdown Challenge or not.
Maybe say a little bit about it.
It's sponsored by a group out in Portland in the Northwest, but they've been running for a couple of years now. And what they do is they take the top 20 drawdown strategies and challenge teams to sign up to work on addressing whichever one or ones of the top 20 drawdown strategies intrigue them most and decide they're appropriate to work on as a team. And the teams tend to be everything from a school to an informal community group. And through their online platform, they record the achievements of individual teams and of the whole collective group, so that you can see that the top 20 drawdown strategies, which have been, I presume people are familiar with drawdown. There's been several drawdown sessions online, but what I'm wondering is for moving a team forward during the 3-week challenge period, or taking a team's coming together and learning and reflections and ability to see a different future through their actions that are meaningful in achieving reductions of greenhouse gases, and expanding that community-wide after the challenge, whether you've ever considered linking your efforts with that kind of a large-scale initiative to try to build on those sorts of initiatives to really move to a grander scale.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm not opposed to it, and I think we haven't worked with them, but I think that there's a difference between it's a challenge, right? As you point out, like the local, a a lot of the way that we change as human beings is when we have a personal experience, which is small scale. It's a scale of one, or it's a scale of a community, and yet we need that to be happening at scale. And so one of the ways that we think about kind of the role that we play in this space is actually making it visible what is happening at smaller scales and replicating that. So replicating what works, spreading what works. And sometimes it could be at scale. I mean, I think there have been some examples of, I showed a picture of The Day After Tomorrow, which I think is not a great example because of for many reasons, but movies or mainstream cultural narratives, like those can transform a lot of people at once. And so I think it's about kind of, but I guess my point is, my guess is a lot of the stuff, it sounds like a lot of the stuff that's happening, even with the drawdown work, is happening in local places, but it's amplified. And I think that's a lot of how I think this work is going to happen, which is, how do we, and targeting places like, I think, the example I gave about Kentucky Gold Country, if we prevent places like that from turning towards or giving them helping them have alternatives to extractive industries, that has a ripple effect on all of us. Standing Rock is another great example. So I think, figuring out what those like pivot points are, or those really like kind of catalytic spots. But yeah, I think you're making a great point, and I would love to figure out how to kind of bridge the scales in our work.
It's the challenge that we all face in making the big enough impact to move forward, and I'd love to see, given the scientific basis of the drawdown strategies, I'd love to see something enable them to go even further. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the metaphor that I've been thinking a lot lately is like the mycelium metaphor, something that's really small, but because it's connected, it's big and really powerful. And I think that, or, a virus or whatever, like things that, because I think that's kind of the way that culture works. It isn't an election, or it could manifest in an election. It's a series of really small things that get replicated many, many times.
Thanks. Does anyone have any parting, with 3 minutes left on the call, thoughts? Well.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yep, go ahead.
Everything out there. I don't know that we really have time to address this, but Alexis, I was wondering if you could touch on, especially with like the Clear Creek creative work and maybe some of the other projects you've done. It seems like that work does a good job of bringing in the disenfranchised and frontline communities, and maybe the communities that wouldn't normally go to, say, a town hall meeting or another event like that. Can you speak a little to the methods that you use in those projects to ensure that you can reach those communities, and how those methods differ with arts integration compared to stand?
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to be clear, I'm not running those projects. I'm just studying them. But yeah, I mean, that's a main value, I think, in working through arts and culture, is that a lot of people won't come to a community meeting after work about water quality in their neighborhood, but they will come to a concert, or they will. So I think, and finding ways that people can engage that are culturally relevant is really important. So there are a lot of examples of communities where people have really tried to engage them in, maybe environmentalists have really tried to engage a local community around river cleanup, for example. I'm thinking of a specific example in around the Duwamish River in Seattle. And, the kind of assumption of the organizers was, well, river cleanup is something that we do. We like to do this. Of course, people want to come and do this. And that wasn't how the community wanted to engage. And it also, stimulated a lot of fear about the state of the river. But when they engaged people, these artists partnered with the environmental groups to engage people around a celebratory festival that included, it was a multicultural community around, how their culture thought about water and the role that it played in their culture. It was an immigrant community, a lot of Native people came out in droves to celebrate, and the river got cleaned up. So I think that, thinking about kind of how do you engage people differently based on where they're coming from and what they care about is a great value of culture. And we could go on for a long time on that, but the relevancy of the particular culture that you're using must match the community that you're trying to reach.
Great. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so thank you so much. This is just a really important conversation, I think, to be had, and I'm glad you presented today. And I hope everyone has a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Kristen.
Bye.